Hi, I'm Peter Litchfield. It is my pleasure once again to speak to you on the subject of breathing in behalf of the Shambhala Mountain Center and the Graduate School of Breathing Sciences. This is the fourth video in a series of 4 on the subject of dysfunctional breathing habits with a special emphasis on overbreathing and its effects. In this video, I will go over the questions that you have previously submitted in regards to the materials I presented in the first 3 videos. I will be taking about 10 of your questions, but first I have a couple of announcements. Should you be interested in a breathing consultation session with our practicum supervisor at the graduate school, please contact Sandra Raymer at her email, which has been listed elsewhere. And I will mention it again here. Her email is sr@bp.edu. That's sr@bp.edu. And you can call her, if you wish, at 505-946-8919. That's 505-946-8919. And you can leave her a message there and she'll get back to you. A second announcement has to do with the upcoming workshop that's being offered by Shambhala Mountain Center and the Graduate School of Breathing Sciences. This workshop is called Optimizing Respiration for Health and Performance. It elaborates further on what I have presented in the earlier 3 videos. Now, this workshop will be highly interactive. I'll be taking questions and listening to your comments. I'll be doing demonstrations and guided breathing kinds of exercise experiences with you. You will need a headset so that you can interact. You can use the video on your laptop so we can see you. Who should be attending this course? Well, basically a lot of different people may be interested. If you're interested in learning about your own breathing from a different perspective, this will be a great course for you. If you're interested in checking out the possibility that you may be suffering with a dysfunctional breathing habit, again, please come to the workshop. Then, if you're interested in helping people that you work with in your professional practice that may be suffering from a dysfunctional breathing habit, this would be a great course for you to come to learn about how to do that. And then lastly, should you be interested in integrating behavioral principles into your personal or professional breathing practice, this would be a great place to come and learn more. Again, the dates start January 13, and then they follow on a week later on subsequent Tuesdays. That is on January 20, 27, and February 3rd. The course is a total of 6 hours. We do an hour and a half in each session. We run from 6 o'clock to 7:30 in the evening Mountain Time. During the first session, you will need to come early so we can make sure that your equipment is working properly. Please plan to check in at 5:30 if you're coming to this workshop. Now, on January 13th, we'll be talking about identifying dysfunctional habits that you may have. I'll be doing some live demonstrations. On January 20th, we'll be looking at your breathing mechanics. Again, I'll be doing some guided breathing exploration with you. January 27th, we'll be looking at breathing chemistry and whether your mechanics are in alignment with that chemistry. And February 3rd, we'll be looking at challenges and how you deal with those stress challenges or emotional challenges from a breathing perspective, and how you can learn habits that become automatic that are aligned with good respiration. So now let's turn to some questions that you've sent along to me. I'm looking forward to giving you some brief answers. I have a couple of questions I'm going to address that came from Carol. And her first question was that she was wondering about the scientific research that what I've been talking about is based on. Well, first of all of the physiology I was talking to you about basically comes just from any pulmonary physiology textbook. Here's a textbook that for medical students and for practicing physicians who want to bone up on their pulmonary physiology. It's called Pulmonary Physiology by Levitsky. It's just an example of many, many books. And everything I talked about in terms of symptoms that are generated, the acid-base physiology that I talked about, it's all right in any textbook like this. And here's another book, for example, called Clinical Acid-Base Balance, which basically has a major elaboration on the things that I talked about. These books are all over the place. It's just basic physiology. There's nothing special about me and my knowledge on this. I'm just, from that perspective, a run-of-the-mill physiologist in terms of my basic knowledge of pulmonary physiology. Okay, so that's been documented for many, many years. There are thousands of studies on the subject of the role of carbon dioxide in fundamental respiratory physiology. It's been around for decade after decade. Very, very extremely well documented. If that weren't the case, you wouldn't be seeing this physiology in anesthesiology, where surgery is done, monitoring blood gases based on this fundamental physiology. Secondly, the techniques that we use and the assessment we do for dysfunctional breathing habits comes from things like this. Here's a book called The Principles of Behavior Analysis, basically habit analysis. There are hundreds of books on applied behavioral analysis. Everything that we do and I do comes from this very large literature in psychology. It's all based on behavior therapy. So there's nothing new here. This is as old as the hills. There are thousands of studies done with things like negative practice that I mentioned to you in one of my videos. Thirdly, here's a book on behavior modification. The techniques that we use to help people overcome dysfunctional breathing habits are based on books like this. There are hundreds of books on the subject of behavior modification and all kinds of techniques that are applicable to working with people with dysfunctional breathing habits. The research literature here is extremely extensive. It's the most extensive literature that we have in the field of psychology when it comes to real practical applications. And then if you're really interested in blood gases, here's something all you really need to know to interpret arterial blood gases. There are huge literatures on this. There's a book, for example, on capnography that's about 600 pages long, written by about 40 different physicians and physiologists about CO2 and how it's relevant in medical practice. So the basis for what we do is completely there. Ultimately, it's about the client that we work with. We have to be able to demonstrate that there is a CO2 deficiency. And we have to be able to demonstrate that that deficiency is a function of a dysfunctional habit, which is what we do when we do a session. We have to pinpoint the symptoms that are associated with that habit before we move forward. If we can do that, then we move forward, and at the end of the time that we may be working with you, we can then go back and see whether those triggers are still bringing on those habits. We can see whether those habits are really there, or whether they have been addressed. And we can measure it and we can see, just as clear as day. Or we can have a person, for example, overventilate on purpose, and then we look to see whether it generates the symptoms that they're dealing with. And if they back off from doing that overbreathing and the symptoms disappear, there you have it. So ultimately, it boils down to making measurements with the clients we work with at the beginning, and then we look to see how they've changed over a period of time. Carol also had a second question. How is your work, she was asking, similar or different from the work of Dr. Buteyko, a physician from Russia who has since passed on? None of our work is based on Buteyko's work. None of the physiology we talk about came from his work. His work was really based on the research done by physiologists and others over very many decades. He's an example of a wonderful practitioner who went to that physiology and then utilized that physiology to develop a technique that's been very useful for people who suffer with asthma problems. Okay, third, we have a question from Tink. who says, I'm a yoga instructor and your videos are causing me anxiety as to whether what I'm teaching could be doing harm. First, you're not going to be doing any harm from a physical perspective. It is possible that people could learn dysfunctional habits as a function of manipulating their breath. But there's a lot you can do to avoid that. You can learn to integrate the kinds of things I'm talking about into your yoga practice very successfully. I've worked with people who are professional yoga teachers and instructors for many, many years, and you can do very effective work bringing this into what you're doing. Come to the workshop and we can talk further about that. Then we have a question from Latmui, I'm not sure how to pronounce the name, and they say, this person says, a controlled and conscious breathing practice also would do damage to our body? No, don't worry about physical damage. There's very unlikely to be physical damage. However, if a person is suffering with a organic physiological problem of some kind, like maybe they have angina, and if you're doing improper kinds of breathing, you have a dysfunctional habit, and you're dealing with angina or you're dealing with epilepsy, you could trigger an angina attack, you could trigger an asthma attack. There are precautions that need to be taken. So if you're doing a conscious controlled practice, of course you want to be sure that you're not disturbing the chemistry. This relates to the same question that Tink asked. There was a question from Rebecca. She was interested in knowing how overbreathing might be playing a role in sleep disturbances, and it can play a significant role in sleep disturbances. I don't have time to go into detail here. For example, in sleep apnea, it can play a major role. It can play a role in insomnia. If you start to overventilate when you lie down, that can create problems where the trigger for the habit is actually lying down and trying to go to sleep. That's something we could take up during the workshop if you were interested. Then we had a couple of questions from Nick from Berlin, Germany, which I'll just touch on very, very briefly here. He was wondering about hyperventilation techniques such as in holotropic breathing, which he says is found to have beneficial effects. Hyperventilation does not have beneficial effects, Nick. It compromises respiration. Holotropic breathing can be useful for sure because it gets people in touch with parts of themselves that they may have been avoiding. Very often, holotropic breathing will trigger memories of all kinds that people can learn to cope with. Now, you may be compromising respiration, and that isn't good for you any more than it is to take certain drugs. It really isn't good for you to take those psychiatric drugs, but they have a purpose. There's a reason for doing it. And holotropic breathing can be very, very useful in psychotherapy and in personal exploration. Not because it has positive effects on the physiology, it doesn't. It has negative effects, but it can help you explore yourself psychologically. There's something we call state-dependent learning, which is a very important consideration in doing the kind of work we do. People learn breathing, they develop a different sense of themselves based on breathing in one way versus another way. It's like when a person takes a drug, you get a different kind of personality that emerges than when they're not on that drug. The same thing can be true of overbreathing, where you change neurochemistry, you create a different state, and then you can trigger different aspects of yourself that you can then work with in the same way you might do with a psychiatric drug. Okay, so it can be a very useful kind of a thing. Not to say that it has beneficial physiological effects, it doesn't. But what's important in holotropic breathing is that you don't develop a dysfunctional habit as a result of doing it. And if it's done properly, you're not going to. A second question you had to do with CO2 and bicarbonates. And that's a little bit difficult to address in a short time, but I can say this to you, that the bicarbonates are regulated by the kidneys, and if there is excessive bicarbonate, those bicarbonates are excreted through the urine. And if there are not enough bicarbonates in the system, you will start, and you're right about this, if there's not enough bicarbonates because you're suffering from lactic acidosis or you're suffering from ketoacidosis, you have diabetes or something like that, you will start to ventilate more and you will give off more CO2, and the CO2 level will come down below normal. On the other hand, it will compensate for the acidosis. The breath is a regulator of pH and will then seek to, through a compensatory reflex, you will have a return of the pH in the correct direction as a result of breathing one way or another. I really can't go into greater detail than that and really do justice to other questions here. If you're interested, please email me or come to the workshop and we can speak further about it. We had a question from Karen, and she's talking about hiking and being out of breath. Well, the chances are you're probably not in that good a shape. On the other hand, you may be overventilating. It is very, very common in athletes that if they overventilate, then they really feel out of breath unnecessarily because they give off too much carbon dioxide and they get into trouble. This is very common. I could give you some interesting case histories on that. I know a gymnast, for example, whenever she'd start to do exercise, she would start to overventilate, and so she couldn't do her gymnastics anymore, and she, in essence, had to learn to not overventilate when she started to do her exercise. I have no idea whether this is true in your case, but it could be. Come to our workshop. Maybe you can learn. We can address that. It would be very interesting to talk about that. We had a question from Kathy. A couple of questions I'll take from her. One had to do with holding her breath, that when she was a child, she said she had an unhappy family situation, and this may have been a way of controlling her distress by holding her breath. Now, holding your breath, that's a very interesting subject. A lot of people think that because you hold your breath, you're depriving yourself of oxygen. That's simply not the case. People don't hold their breath more than a short time, and you'd have to hold your breath for an awfully long time before it would have any effect on oxygen levels. You can get an oximeter. I do this all the time for demonstrations. Get an oximeter and hold your breath and notice that your oxygen saturation levels really aren't affected. It's really about two reasons, among others, that people hold their breath. One is because it gives them a sense of control that Kathy was alluding to. And that can, of course, in the long run, lead to throwing off your respiration and getting in the way of reflexes, and there may be a problem. But another reason for doing is when you hold your breath, you build your CO2 levels back up, so it can be quite an adaptive thing to do. If you're overventilating, you hold your breath, that can actually be a constructive thing to do. And lastly, Kathy talked about having asthma. Based on what you have had to say, Kathy, I would hope you might come to our workshop. And you noticed it was helpful for you to extend the exhale and what I recommended in one of my videos, but still you felt out of breath. Still it was a challenge. Still there is, you mentioned here that you really aren't trusting your breath. Well, this is a very, very, very important element of training, is to locate that reflex, develop a trust in your breath so that you can allow it and that you're not getting in the way of things and perhaps bringing on your asthma as a consequence of overventilating. Anyway, those are some answers to your questions. I wish I had time to answer more questions, but I look forward to seeing you sometime in the future. I hope you come to this workshop or one of our workshops in the future that Shambhala will be offering along with the Graduate School of Breathing Sciences. Thank you very much.